Reverend Marcus Ellison sat in his modest church office, a beam of warm sunlight streaming through the window and falling over the stacks of books on his desk. His phone buzzed, vibrating against the wooden surface, jolting him out of his thoughts as he prepared his sermon for the upcoming Sunday. He glanced at the caller ID, a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant but curious, he picked up. "Reverend Ellison speaking," he answered, his deep, steady voice filling the room. "This is Claire Jennings from the office of President Donald Trump," a professional voice replied on the other end. "The president would like to visit your church this Sunday and speak to the congregation as part of his community outreach efforts." Ellison froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Donald Trump? The man whose name stirred passionate debates and polarized opinions? A man who, to many in his congregation, represented an institution they'd spent generations fighting against? I see," Ellison said carefully, leaning back in his chair. "Why this church?" "The president has expressed a desire to connect with communities across America, Reverend. Your church's history of activism and community engagement makes it a natural choice." The Reverend's eyes flicked to the framed black and white photo hanging on his wall, a snapshot of his late father standing with Martin Luther King Jr. outside this very church. Mount Zion Baptist had been a cornerstone of the civil rights movement in their city, a sanctuary for those who fought tirelessly for equality and justice. "This is a surprising request," he said cautiously. "I'll need to consult with my church elders before making any decisions." "Of course, Reverend," Claire replied, her tone remaining neutral. "We'll await your confirmation. The president is hoping to join you this Sunday." The call ended with polite pleasantries, leaving Ellison sitting in stunned silence. That evening, the Reverend called an emergency meeting with the church elders. They gathered in the fellowship hall, the room buzzing with whispered speculations as the Reverend entered, a somber expression on his face. "Family," he began, addressing them as he always did. "I've received an unusual invitation today. President Trump wants to attend our Sunday service and speak to the congregation." The room erupted. Some elders leaned forward in disbelief. Others shook their heads vehemently. Deaconess Clara Williams, an outspoken advocate for social justice, was the first to speak. "Reverend, with all due respect, this feels like a publicity stunt," she said firmly. "What could he possibly have to say to our congregation that we haven't already heard on the news?" "I understand your concerns, Sister Clara," Ellison said, raising a hand to calm the room. "But I believe we should hear him out before we make any decisions." "I don't know, Reverend," said Elder Joseph Daniels, a soft-spoken but influential figure in the church. "Our people have fought too hard for too long to let someone use our sacred space as a stage." "But isn't this the very essence of our faith?" another elder countered. "To open our doors, even to those we might not agree with? Isn't forgiveness and dialogue what we preach every Sunday?" The room fell into a tense debate. Some saw the invitation as an opportunity to hold the president accountable, to challenge him on his policies and rhetoric. Others viewed it as an insult to the church's legacy. The Reverend listened carefully, his hands folded on the table, weighing every word. After an hour of spirited discussion, Ellison stood. "I hear you all, and I share many of your concerns. But this church has always been a place where bridges are built, not burned. If the president wants to speak, we'll let him. But rest assured, this will not be a one-way conversation. He'll hear from us too." The room was quiet for a moment before heads began to nod, albeit reluctantly. When the announcement was made to the congregation during midweek Bible study, reactions were just as polarized. Some gasped in shock, others muttered in disapproval. A young mother raised her hand. "Reverend, I'm worried this might be a distraction. How do we know he's sincere?" Ellison nodded thoughtfully. "I don't know, Sister Thompson, but if we close our doors, we may never find out. Our faith calls us to show grace, even when it's uncomfortable." A teenage boy in the back raised his hand next. "What if he comes just to make himself look good? Like, what if this is all fake?" "Then we'll see it for what it is," Ellison said, his voice calm but resolute. "But if there's even a chance that this could lead to understanding, shouldn't we take it?" The room fell silent. While doubts lingered, the congregation trusted their Reverend's wisdom. Meanwhile, In the gilded halls of the White House, Trump's advisors discussed the visit. Trump leaned back in his chair as Claire Jennings briefed him. "Mr. President, the congregation may be skeptical of your motives, so may not even want you there." "Good," Trump said, surprising her. "Let them be skeptical. That's why I need to go. People think I don't care. Maybe I've made mistakes, but I want to show them I'm listening." Jennings hesitated before nodding. Despite his often brash demeanor, there was something genuine in his tone. That night, as Trump prepared for the visit, he thought about the speeches he'd given in the past. This time, he didn't want it to be about politics. It needed to be about something more, something real. As Sunday approached, Mount Zion Baptist buzzed with anticipation and anxiety. Some members prepared to skip the service altogether, unwilling to witness what they feared would be a spectacle. Others planned to attend, curious to see what might unfold. And through it all, Reverend Ellison prayed for wisdom, for courage, and for the strength to guide his congregation through what promised to be a moment they would never forget. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that hinted at promise but carried the weight of uncertainty. At Mount Zion Baptist Church, the usual hum of pre-service preparation had turned into a buzz of anxious energy. Ushers moved through the aisles, straightening hymnals and adjusting the golden fabric draped over the altar. Choir members rehearsed one last time, their voices soaring to the rafters, though some couldn't help but glance toward the doors, wondering if the man everyone was whispering about would actually show up. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Church members stood in clusters, their Sunday best gleaming under the morning sun, while a handful of protesters held signs, their faces tight with determination. Across the street, reporters adjusted their cameras, eager to capture every moment. The tension was palpable, a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and unease. Reverend Marcus Ellison stood at the church steps, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He had spent the past few days preparing for this moment, rehearsing how he would greet the president, what he would say, how he would balance the duty of hospitality with the responsibility of accountability. But now that the moment was near, his heart felt heavy. He looked over the crowd and then back at the church doors, a sanctuary he had spent decades protecting, now on the cusp of becoming a stage for something far beyond his control. The low rumble of engines drew everyone's attention. Heads turned as the presidential motorcade came into view, black SUVs gliding down the street like shadows. The vehicle slowed to a stop in front of the church, and the air seemed to still. Secret Service agents stepped out first, scanning the area with practiced precision. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the main SUV opened, and Donald Trump stepped out. Dressed in his signature dark suit and red tie, he looked exactly as he did on television. Yet something about his demeanor seemed different. He wasn't waving grandly or making his usual bold proclamations. Instead, he moved deliberately, his gaze meeting the eyes of those around him. There was no mistaking the wariness in the air. Some faces in the crowd were stony, their arms crossed, while others wore expressions of cautious curiosity. Trump approached Reverend Ellison with an outstretched hand. "Reverend," he said, his voice quieter than expected. "Thank you for having me." Ellison shook his hand firmly, his eyes searching Trump's face for sincerity. "Mr. President, welcome to Mount Zion," he replied. "I hope you find this house of worship a place of reflection and truth." Trump nodded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. For a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed far away, and the two men simply regarded each other. Then, with a subtle gesture from the Secret Service, the president ascended the steps and entered the church. Inside, the congregation was already seated, their murmurs ceasing as Trump stepped into the sanctuary. The contrast was striking, the opulence of a man used to gold-plated towers meeting the humble beauty of the wooden pews and stained glass windows that had witnessed decades of struggle and triumph. Trump paused just inside the doors, his gaze sweeping the room. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the weight of where he was. Reverend Ellison gestured toward the front pew, reserved for the president and his team. As Trump walked down the aisle, the congregation watched in silence. Some sat stiffly, their hands clenched in their laps. Others whispered behind raised hands. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a loud whisper, "Is that really him?" She hushed him quickly, her eyes darting to the president. Trump took his seat, nodding politely to the choir as they began their opening hymn. The music filled the space, rich and soulful, a blend of pain and hope that spoke to the heart of the church's history. Trump's expression softened, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee in time with the melody. He didn't seem like the man from the podiums and debates. For a moment, he simply looked like someone who was listening. As the service progressed, the congregation began to relax, just slightly. The choir sang with a fervor that brought tears to more than one set of eyes. Reverend Ellison's sermon was impassioned, weaving scripture with stories of resilience and forgiveness. He didn't address Trump directly, but his words were pointed. True leadership, he said, his voice steady, is not about power. It's about humility. It's about serving those who need you most, even when it costs you something. Trump shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. Whether the words struck a nerve or simply passed over him was impossible to tell. When it was time for Trump to speak, the tension in the room spiked again. As he stood and made his way to the pulpit, a wave of murmurs rippled through the congregation. He paused at the microphone, gripping the edges of the podium as though steadying himself. "Thank you for having me here today," he began, his voice resonating through the sanctuary. "I know not everyone in this room agrees with me. I know some of you may not even want me here, but I came because I want to listen. I want to learn." The murmurs ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. People leaned forward in their seats, their skepticism mingling with curiosity. Trump continued, his tone more subdued than anyone had expected. "I'll be honest," he said. "I've made mistakes. I've said things I shouldn't have. But I'm here today because I believe in the power of faith, the power of community, and the power of change." For the first time, he looked uncertain, his words halting as he glanced around the room. The man who had built a career on confidence and control now seemed vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, there was something disarming. As he spoke, sharing stories and reflections that surprised even his harshest critics, the mood in the room began to shift. Some faces softened, their arms uncrossing. Others still watched with guarded expressions, unwilling to be swayed just yet. But one thing was clear. This was not the man they had expected. When Trump returned to his seat, the congregation remained silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It was a silence not of judgment, but of contemplation. And as the service continued, the lines that had seemed so firmly drawn at the beginning of the day began, ever so slightly, to blur. The sanctuary was alive with anticipation, though the tension in the air was undeniable. The usual hum of pre-sermon energy was quieter, more subdued. The choir had just finished their second hymn, a rousing rendition of Amazing Grace that soared through the room, filling every corner with notes of redemption and hope. Some sang along softly, while others sat motionless, their thoughts elsewhere. Reverend Marcus Ellison stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the edges as he took a deep breath, preparing to address a congregation more divided than he'd ever seen it. He wasn't just speaking to his flock today. He was speaking in the presence of a man whose name alone sparked arguments around dinner tables and in community meetings. Reverend Ellison had always believed that words, when spoken from the heart, could be powerful tools for healing. But today, his words would have to do more than inspire. They would need to bridge a chasm that felt impossibly wide. "Good morning, church," he began, his voice calm and steady. "Good morning, family." The congregation murmured a reply, their voices uneven. The Reverend's eyes swept over the room, pausing briefly on faces he knew well. Sister Clara Williams, sitting stiffly in the third pew, her lips pursed in a tight line. Young Michael Carter, fidgeting with his tie, a look of skepticism etched into his features. And, of course, the president himself, seated in the front row, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression unreadable. Today, the Reverend continued, is not like every other Sunday. Today, we find ourselves faced with an opportunity and a challenge. An opportunity to listen, to reflect, to allow grace to lead us in difficult conversations, but also a challenge to confront what divides us, even when it feels easier to walk away. He paused, letting his words settle. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of a pew or the soft rustle of a bulletin. Reverend Ellison began to pace slowly, his footsteps deliberate. In the book of Matthew, Jesus tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. That's not a suggestion, it's a commandment. But let's be honest with ourselves. Sometimes it's hard to love our neighbors, isn't it? A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, faint and hesitant. He stopped and rested his hands on the pulpit again, leaning forward slightly. Sometimes our neighbors don't look like us. Sometimes they don't talk like us. They don't think like us. And when that happens, when the divide feels too wide, the world tells us it's okay to stop trying, to retreat into our own corners and build walls around our hearts. He straightened, his voice growing stronger. But that's not what God calls us to do. No, family. God calls us to lean into the discomfort, to see the humanity in others, even when it feels impossible, to extend a hand when the world tells us to turn our backs. From his seat, Trump's gaze lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing in thought. The Reverend noticed but didn't falter. He hadn't written this sermon with the president in mind. He had written it for everyone in the room, including himself. "I'm not asking you to ignore your pain," Reverend Ellison said, his voice softer now. "I'm not asking you to forget the struggles you've faced or the injustices you've witnessed. Those are real. They are valid. But what I am asking, what God is asking, is that you leave the door open for grace to walk in." He looked out over the congregation again, his eyes settling on Sister Clara. She shifted in her seat, but didn't look away. "I know some of you are hurting today," he said gently. "I know some of you feel like your voices haven't been heard, that your experiences haven't been valued. And I know some of you are asking, why should I listen when no one has listened to me?" The Reverend's voice broke slightly, and he let the emotion come through. "I don't have all the answers, family. But I do know this. Change doesn't happen in silence. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. If we want to build something better, we have to start here. Right now. Together." He turned to the choir, who began to hum softly, their voices blending into a gentle, almost meditative melody. The sound filled the room, wrapping itself around the congregation like a warm blanket. In a few moments, Reverend Ellison said, his voice carrying over the hum, "We'll hear from a man who, like all of us, is imperfect. A man who has made mistakes, as we all have. But before we hear his words, I want us to take a moment to pray, not just for him, but for ourselves, for our hearts to remain open, for our minds to seek understanding, even when it's hard." He bowed his head, and the congregation followed, the room descending into a stillness that felt almost sacred. The only sounds were the faint breaths of those around him and the rhythmic hum of the choir. "Lord," Reverend Ellison prayed, his voice low but steady, "we come to you today as a family, imperfect and in need of your guidance. We ask for strength to listen, even when it's hard. We ask for wisdom to see beyond our differences. And we ask for courage to walk the path of love, even when the world tries to pull us in the other direction. Amen." When he lifted his head, the congregation followed. There was a noticeable shift in the room. Not a resolution, but perhaps a softening. A willingness, however hesitant, to engage. The Reverend stepped back from the pulpit, his eyes locking with Trump's for a brief moment. Then he gestured toward the microphone. It was time. Donald Trump rose slowly from the front pew, smoothing his suit as he stepped into the aisle. All eyes were on him, and the air in the sanctuary seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. There were murmurs, low and scattered, as he made his way to the pulpit. The congregation had been polite so far, but the tension was palpable. Some watched him with curiosity, others with guarded skepticism, their faces a mosaic of emotions. Trump climbed a few steps to the pulpit, gripping its edges as he stood behind it. For a man accustomed to commanding stadiums and rallies, the intimacy of this room seemed to take him off guard. The stained glass windows, the flickering light of the candles near the altar, the weight of history and faith that filled the space. None of it matched the grandeur he was used to. And yet, it carried a gravity he couldn't ignore. He cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone. "Thank you, Reverend Ellison, for inviting me here today. And thank you to everyone in this congregation for welcoming me into your church." The word welcome hung in the air. A few people exchanged glances, as though questioning how much of a welcome this really was. Trump seemed to notice. His eyes flicked across the room, and for the first time, there was no trademark bravado in his gaze. Instead, there was something quieter, more hesitant. "I know that some of you didn't want me here," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. "And I don't blame you." That admission, so unexpected, caused a ripple of surprise. A few murmurs rose from the back of the room, quickly silenced by a sharp glance from Sister Clara. Trump pressed on. "I've spent a lot of my life speaking to crowds," he said. "I've stood in arenas filled with thousands of people. But this feels different. It feels important in a way I didn't expect." He paused, looking down at the wooden podium for a moment, as though searching for the right words. When he looked up again, his expression had shifted. The guardedness was still there, but it was mingled with something else, vulnerability. "I came here today because I want to listen," he said. "I want to understand, and I want to be honest with you." The room was silent now, save for the faint rustle of a child shifting in the pews. Trump took a deep breath. "When I was a kid," he began, "I grew up in Queens, New York. It was a different world back then. My father was a strict man, a businessman through and through. He taught me how to work hard, how to build things, how to succeed. But there were other lessons I missed along the way. Lessons about people, about understanding those who lived differently than I did." He paused again, his hands tightening on the edges of the pulpit. "I didn't understand back then what it meant to live in someone else's shoes, to struggle in ways I never had to. And I'll admit, for a long time, I didn't try to understand." There was a subtle shift in the room. Some of the more skeptical faces softened, their arms uncrossing slightly. Trump seemed to notice, and it gave him the courage to continue. "Over the years, I've made decisions. Some of them good, some of them not. And I know that some of those decisions have hurt people. People like you. People in communities like this one." This time, the murmurs were louder, less restrained. Trump didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded, as though acknowledging their right to respond. "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness," he said. "That's not my place. I'm here to tell you that I hear you, that I see you." His voice wavered slightly on the last words, and he steadied himself. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be strong, trying to win, trying to be the loudest voice in the room. But being here today, I realized something. Strength isn't about being the loudest. It's about being willing to admit when you're wrong. It's about being willing to learn." For the first time, Trump's usual polished delivery faltered. His voice cracked slightly, and he paused, visibly gathering himself. "I've learned a lot in the past few years. About division, about anger, about pain, and about the role I've played in all of it. And I know that saying these words doesn't fix anything. But maybe it's a start." He looked out at the congregation again, his gaze lingering on the faces of the older members, those who had lived through the civil rights movement and seen the worst of America's injustices. "When I walked into this church today, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time. I felt small." The room was utterly silent now. Even the children, who had been squirming earlier, sat still. "I felt small because this place isn't about power or politics or success," Trump said. "It's about something much bigger. It's about faith, about love, about the things that hold us together when everything else falls apart." He gripped the edges of the pulpit a little tighter. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if anything I say or do can change how you feel about me. But I promise you this, I will try to do better. I will try to be better." His final words hung in the air, echoing through the room. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere in the middle pews, a voice called out, "Amen." It was a single word, but it broke the tension like a dam giving way. Others joined in, hesitant at first, then louder. "Amen," someone else said. "Amen," another echoed. The sound grew, swelling into a chorus that filled the sanctuary. Trump stepped back from the pulpit, his expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He nodded to Reverend Ellison, who rose from his seat and approached the podium. "Thank you, Mr. President," Ellison said, his voice warm but measured. "Thank you for your honesty. And thank you for reminding us all that the journey toward understanding is never easy, but it is always worth taking." The congregation remained silent as Trump returned to his seat. For the first time since entering the church, he allowed himself to exhale. He had done what he came to do. Now, all he could do was hope that his words had meant something. The sanctuary was utterly still as Donald Trump returned to his seat in the front pew. The only sound was the faint creak of his shoes on the polished wooden floor. He sat down carefully, his shoulders rigid, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The congregation seemed frozen, their collective gaze fixed on him, as if trying to decide what to make of what they had just heard. For a moment, it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath. The tension that had been simmering throughout the service now boiled over into an uneasy silence. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others sat perfectly still, their eyes trained on the pulpit where Reverend Marcus Ellison had stepped forward once more. Reverend Ellison cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. President, for sharing your thoughts with us today," he said, his voice steady and calm. He paused, scanning the room, his gaze lingering on familiar faces. Faces that carried the weight of history, pain, and resilience. "Family," he continued, addressing the congregation, "now is the time for us to speak. This is not a one-way conversation. If anyone would like to share their thoughts, their reflections, or even their questions, the floor is open." For a few seconds, no one moved. The invitation hung in the air, heavy with the potential for confrontation or connection. Finally, Sister Clara Williams, a long-standing elder of the church, stood up. Her movements were deliberate, her back straight, her expression stern. All eyes turned to her as she made her way to the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Reverend," she began, her voice firm but not unkind, "I've been a member of this church for over 50 years. I've seen presidents come and go. I've marched in the streets. I've fought for civil rights. And I've lived through promises made and broken." She turned slightly, her sharp eyes landing on Trump, who met her gaze with a mix of uncertainty and respect. "I'll admit," she continued, "when I heard you were coming here, I wasn't happy. I didn't think you had anything to say to us that we hadn't already heard from 100 politicians before you." But she paused, her voice softening. "But I'll also admit that I saw something today I wasn't expecting. Vulnerability, humility. And while I don't know if your words will lead to action, I do believe in giving people a chance to prove themselves." The congregation murmured in agreement, a ripple of tentative approval moving through the room. Trump nodded slightly, his lips pressed together as though he didn't quite know how to respond. Next, a younger man rose to his feet. Michael Carter, barely in his 20s, wore a crisp shirt and tie that made him look older than his years. His hands were trembling slightly as he stepped into the aisle. "Reverend," he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word, "I respect this church, and I respect you for inviting the president here. But I have to be honest, I'm not convinced." He turned toward Trump, his brow furrowed. "You talk about listening, about wanting to understand, but where was that understanding when you had the power to make a difference? Where was that humility when people like me were out in the streets, begging for justice?" The room grew quiet again, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Trump looked at the young man, his face unreadable. Then slowly he stood. "I hear you," Trump said, his voice quieter than before. "And you're right to question me. I don't have all the answers, and I can't change the past. But I can promise you this. I'm going to try to be better. I know that might not mean much to you right now, but it's the truth." Michael hesitated, his expression conflicted. Finally, he nodded once, his lips pressed into a thin line, and returned to his seat. The tension in the room seemed to ease slightly, the atmosphere shifting from confrontation to something more nuanced. A fragile understanding, perhaps, or at least a willingness to engage. One by one, other members of the congregation stood to speak. An older man shared a story about growing up in the segregated South and the pain of seeing his community continually overlooked by those in power. A young mother spoke about her hopes for her children and her fears for the world they were growing up in. A teenager asked Trump directly what he planned to do to make good on his words, and Trump, to his credit, didn't deflect the question. "I'm not here to make empty promises," he said, "but I can tell you this. I'm listening, and I want to work with communities like yours to find real solutions. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm open to ideas." The dialogue continued, growing more dynamic as the initial tension began to dissolve. What had started as skepticism, and in some cases outright hostility, began to morph into a genuine exchange. There were still moments of sharp critique, pain that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. But there was also a surprising undercurrent of hope. Toward the end of the discussion, a young girl, no more than 10 years old, raised her hand timidly. The Reverend noticed her and smiled. "Go ahead, sweetheart." She stood on tiptoes to reach the microphone someone had brought to her. "Mr. President," she said, her voice high and clear, "my mama says that people can change if they really want to. Do you really want to?" The simplicity of her question seemed to catch Trump off guard. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening in a way that was almost imperceptible. "Yes," he said finally, "I really do." The congregation erupted into applause. Not unanimous, but significant. There were still those who sat with their arms crossed, their faces unreadable, but the mood in the room had undeniably shifted. As the testimonies wound down, Reverend Ellison returned to the pulpit. "Family," he said, his voice warm and filled with pride, "what we've done here today isn't easy. It's not easy to speak your truth. It's not easy to listen, especially when the words are hard to hear. But this is how healing begins. One conversation at a time." He looked out over the congregation, his gaze lingering on Trump. "Mr. President, thank you for being here and for listening. And thank you, family, for showing the courage to speak your hearts." Trump nodded, a flicker of something almost like gratitude crossing his face. As the Reverend led the congregation in a closing prayer, heads bowed and hands joined, there was a sense that something profound had happened. Not a resolution, perhaps, but a step forward. A step toward understanding, however tentative, however fragile. And as the final notes of the choir's song filled the sanctuary, the air felt lighter, as though the burdens of the day had been lifted, if only slightly. The congregation rose from their pews, their voices mingling in quiet conversations, their steps carrying them into a world that suddenly felt a little more open to possibility. In the days following Trump's visit to Mount Zion Baptist Church, the ripple effects of the event began to spread far beyond the sanctuary. It started with local news reports, capturing snippets of the service, the president's speech, the congregation's testimonies, and the emotional moments that had left many in tears. The images of Trump standing at the pulpit, his usually confident demeanor softened, were juxtaposed with Reverend Ellison's calm, commanding presence. Within hours, the story was picked up by national media outlets, igniting a firestorm of reactions. Social media became a battleground. Some praised the event as a step toward reconciliation, lauding the Reverend's courage in inviting Trump and commending the congregation for engaging in open dialogue. Others were more skeptical, accusing Trump of using the visit as a PR stunt. Hashtags like #UnityAtMountZion and #EmptyWords trended simultaneously, reflecting the polarized opinions the event had sparked. For Reverend Ellison, the sudden influx of attention was both a blessing and a burden. He had always believed in the power of dialogue, but he hadn't anticipated the intensity of the spotlight now shining on his church. Members of the media camped outside Mount Zion, eager to interview him and the congregants. The phone in his office rang nonstop, and his inbox was flooded with messages, some thanking him for his leadership, others questioning his decision to host the president. One of the most surprising outcomes came from within the congregation itself. Michael Carter, the young man who had confronted Trump during the service, found himself at the center of the conversation. Clips of his impassioned statement went viral, sparking widespread admiration for his bravery. Journalists reached out to him for interviews, and his social media following exploded overnight. Michael, however, wasn't interested in fame. "It wasn't about me," he told a reporter who cornered him outside the church one afternoon. "It was about asking the hard questions. It was about making sure our voices are heard." Meanwhile, Sister Clara Williams, The elder who had expressed cautious hope during the service became a voice of wisdom in the public discourse. In interviews, she spoke about the importance of grace and the complexities of forgiveness. "It's not about forgetting the past," she told one news anchor. "It's about finding a way forward, even when the road is rough." For Trump, the aftermath of the visit was equally complicated. His team had anticipated a mix of praise and criticism, but even they were surprised by the depth of the response. The president himself seemed more reflective in the days that followed. During a staff meeting at the White House, he reportedly told his advisors, "That wasn't just a speech. That was something else. Those people, they weren't afraid to tell me the truth. And maybe I needed to hear it." True to his word, Trump began to take small but notable steps toward engaging with communities he had previously overlooked. He reached out to Reverend Ellison, thanking him again for the opportunity to speak and asking for recommendations on initiatives that could benefit the congregation and the surrounding community. The Reverend, ever pragmatic, didn't waste the chance. He proposed funding for a community center that would provide after-school programs, job training, and mental health resources. To everyone's surprise, Trump approved the funding within weeks. News of the grant sent waves of excitement through Mount Zion Baptist Church. For the first time, many congregants began to feel that the president's words during the service might actually translate into meaningful action. The community center, which had been a dream for years, now seemed within reach. Plans were drawn up, committees were formed, and the congregation threw itself into the project with renewed energy. The announcement also reignited conversations within the community. At local diners, barbershops, and schools, people debated the implications of Trump's visit and the unexpected outcomes that had followed. Some saw it as a sign of progress, while others remained wary, unwilling to trust that one event could signal genuine change. One evening, Reverend Ellison sat down with Michael Carter and Sister Clara in the church's fellowship hall. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the overhead lights. Spread out on the table in front of them were blueprints for the community center, along with a stack of letters from congregants sharing their hopes for what the center could achieve. "This is just the beginning," Ellison said, his voice filled with determination. "We've started something here, not just in this church, but in this whole community. People are talking, people are listening, and that's where change begins." Michael nodded, his expression serious. "But we can't stop here. We need to hold him accountable. Words are one thing, but actions, real, lasting actions, are what matter." Sister Clara smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's the beauty of faith, Michael. It's not about blind trust. It's about hope, even when the path ahead isn't clear." Across the country, the ripples from Mount Zion Sunday service continued to spread. Churches and other communities began to hold their own dialogues, inviting leaders from across the political spectrum to engage in difficult but necessary conversations. Activists and clergy alike cited Reverend Ellison's example as a blueprint for bridging divides. In Washington, Trump's advisors noticed a subtle but significant shift in his approach. He began to prioritize meetings with community leaders and grassroots organizations, often referencing his experience at Mount Zion. "That day changed something in me," he admitted during a private meeting with his staff. "It reminded me that leadership isn't just about speaking, it's about listening." Despite these changes, skepticism lingered. Critics pointed out that one visit to one church couldn't undo years of division. Some argued that the event had been more symbolic than substantive. But for those who had been in the sanctuary that day, the impact was undeniable. The conversations it sparked, the connections it forged, and the seeds of change it planted were proof that something meaningful had begun. Months later, on the day of the community center's groundbreaking ceremony, the entire congregation gathered in the empty lot where the building would stand. Trump himself was not present, but a letter from him was read aloud, expressing his continued support for the project. As the first shovels of dirt were turned, there was a sense of collective pride and hope, a belief that, even in the most unexpected places, the potential for transformation exists. Reverend Ellison stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as children and elders alike joined in the celebration. He thought back to that Sunday morning, to the nerves and the tension, to the moment Trump had taken the stage. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been perfect. But as he looked around at the faces of his community, he knew it had been worth it. Because ripples, when nurtured, can grow into waves. And waves, when guided, have the power to change the world. Months passed since that pivotal Sunday at Mount Zion Baptist Church. The community center, now fully funded and nearing completion, stood as a testament to what dialogue and action could achieve. Its walls, still fresh with paint, symbolized a new chapter for the congregation and the neighborhood it served. Inside, classrooms were being outfitted for after-school tutoring. A small library was being stocked with donated books, and a kitchen awaited its first community meal. Reverend Marcus Ellison stood outside the building on a crisp autumn morning, watching as volunteers carried supplies through the doors. His heart swelled with pride. The project wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was hope made tangible. It was proof that when people come together, even across divides, meaningful change could happen. The dedication ceremony was set for that weekend, and to the surprise of many, Donald Trump announced he would attend. Reactions were mixed. Some in the congregation were eager to see if he would follow through on the promises he'd made during his visit. Others remained skeptical, unsure if his presence would add to the celebration or reopen old wounds. Reverend Ellison, ever the optimist, encouraged his flock to remain open-hearted. "This isn't about him," he reminded them. "This is about us, about what we've built together." The day of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed made for new beginnings. The church parking lot buzzed with activity. Families arrived in their Sunday best. Children chased each other across the lawn, and the choir warmed up with a medley of hymns. A podium had been set up in front of the community center, adorned with flowers and a banner that read, "Unity in Action, Building a Better Future Together." When Trump's motorcade arrived, the atmosphere grew quiet, but not tense. The congregation watched as he stepped out of the car, his expression more subdued than it had been on his first visit. He shook hands with Reverend Ellison, exchanged pleasantries with the elders, and took a seat among the crowd instead of standing immediately at the podium. It was a small gesture, but it didn't go unnoticed. The ceremony began with prayers and speeches from community leaders, each one celebrating the collaborative effort that had brought the center to life. Then, Reverend Ellison introduced Trump, his voice steady and warm. "Today, we're reminded that faith is more than words, it's action. And while none of us are perfect, we are all capable of growth. Mr. President, thank you for being part of this journey." Trump stepped up to the podium, his movements uncharacteristically slow and deliberate. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the crowd. "Thank you, Reverend," he began, his voice softer than usual. "And thank you to everyone here for allowing me to be part of this moment. This community center is more than a building. It's a promise. A promise that when we listen to one another, when we work together, we can achieve incredible things." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "I know I haven't always gotten it right. I know there's still work to do. But seeing this center, seeing what this community has built, it gives me hope. Hope that we can find common ground, even when it seems impossible." The applause that followed was genuine, if measured. It wasn't the thunderous ovation of a rally, but the kind of response that came from cautious optimism. Trump stepped back, allowing the Reverend to close the ceremony. As the ribbon was cut, children cheered, and the choir broke into a jubilant hymn. Trump lingered on the sidelines, shaking hands and speaking quietly with congregants who approached him. He wasn't the center of attention here, and for once, he seemed content with that. Reverend Ellison watched the scene unfold, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. This was what he had prayed for, not a perfect resolution, but a beginning. A chance to show his congregation, his community, and even the nation that healing was possible, one step at a time. And as the sun set over the new community center, its fresh paint glowing in the golden light, the congregation walked away with something more profound than a ceremony. Hope. A hope that bridges, once built, could stand strong. A hope that even the most divided among them could find a way forward together.